Dr. Carole Lieberman. We're going to talk with her. She's a psychiatrist based in Los Angeles. And
she has experience working with homeless patients. And she says the main reason for the homeless problem in L.A. is the closing of the state mental hospitals. Which one takes us back to the Reagan era? Or people always say that.
Well, whatever. I mean, he was governor 50 years ago. So we're in 2019 now. And in 2019, we got thousands and thousands of mental patients on the streets, and you have to put them somewhere, and you have to do it fast. And whatever the sins of the past are doesn't matter anymore. You got to address the present. So let's get Carole Lieberman on here. Carole, how are you?
Hi there. Fine, thank you.
Are you trained in psychiatry at NYU Bellevue?
Yes,
when I was a kid, I grew up in New Jersey. Whenever my mother got exasperated with us, she would always yell at us and say, "I'm going to end up in Bellevue because of you." And that's where you worked.
Yes, indeed. That was an amazing place to train in psychiatry because you see everything, including a lot of homeless. But it was NYU Bellevue, so it was both people who were, more the worried well, and then, of course, Bellevue really took all the patients that other hospitals in New York didn't want to take.
What is the status of mental hospitals in the state? I know they closed some decades ago, but obviously there are still many around. Do we need a lot more?
Well, yes. This idea of deinstitutionalization, that was what it was called, failed. The idea of it was to get the patients out of these state hospitals because, back in the day, I don't know that it was, some of them were as bad as Cuckoo's Nest, but not the majority. And when Thorazine came along, which was in the mid-1950s, that was the first antipsychotic that was approved, and it did help a lot of people, a lot of mentally ill people who were hallucinating and having delusions, mainly schizophrenics. And so they thought, okay, maybe now we can get these people in a less restrictive environment, i.e., in clinics, in halfway houses, board and care. And it was a great idea, except it didn't work because they didn't, in the end, give enough money to establish enough board and cares or halfway houses. And so the people just wound up on the street or when they're not in jail. I mean, that's where the mentally ill people are, on the street, in jails, and in prisons. The only hospitals in California, state hospitals, that are still around are now used for forensic patients. In other words, patients who have been convicted and sent there instead of being sent to jail. So the idea of, yes, some of the state hospitals weren't great, but a lot of them were. And in any case, these patients would be a lot better off in a state hospital than on the streets or in the jails or in the prisons.
Why are there so many more mental patients out on the streets than even 5 years ago? It's clear there's a lot of crazy people in the streets. Where did they come from? Where would they have been 5 years ago?
Well, it's hard. I mean, for one thing, there are more hospitals closing. Cedars, for example, closed just a few years back. That they used to have several units. I was on the staff there. And they closed. I mean, it's really, in a way, it kind of comes down to money for a lot of the situations because the state and then the federal government didn't want to put in as much funding to keep these hospitals open. So they jumped at the chance, we have these antipsychotics now, because most of the people who are homeless or who are in the jails and the prisons who are mentally ill are either schizophrenic or manic depressive, which is also called bipolar, or alcohol abusers or drug abusers. And in any case, when they get out of the hospitals, like let's say they're picked up on the street and they're brought to a regular hospital that has a psychiatric unit, a more acute hospital, they get out in 3 to 10 days because there isn't enough money to keep them in. And so they give them medication for 3 to 10 days approximately. They seem better, and then they discharge them. They dump them somewhere because there aren't enough places to put them that are treatment facilities. And then, of course, they stop taking their medication. They don't go to any follow-up appointments if some have been set up. And that's where they end up on the street, and that's where they end up, many of them committing crimes, and so being in jail.
How does this run up against civil liberties problems here in terms of getting these people into treatment?
Well, that's a problem, too. It was in 1967, approximately, that, that the Lanterman-Petra Short Act was enacted in California, which meant that that's where they put the limits on being able to involuntarily hospitalize someone for only 3 days, and then if you still think they need to be in and they don't want to be in, then you need to have someone from the court check them out, and they can be put in for another 14 days. And then if you think, usually it doesn't go beyond that because there isn't the money for that.
So they thought the antipsychotic drugs would eliminate the need for most mental hospitals, not accounting that mental patients won't take their medication if they're left alone.
Exactly. Well,
that was stupid.
And this whole idea, they've made it so much harder for psychiatrists to have this, to put them in involuntarily. I mean, so many psychiatrists, when I was in Bellevue, we would just put them in if we really thought they needed to be in. Now with time and with this law in California, a lot of psychiatrists are afraid to say that someone needs to be involuntarily hospitalized. They're afraid they'll be sued. So there are so many people that don't even get into the hospital when they're brought there because they are not put in on what's called a 5150, a danger to self, a danger to others, or gravely disabled, which means you can't put a roof over your head and food for yourself. So if, now people are so scared to say that someone meets this criteria, and so a lot of people don't even get in who should get in.
All right, well, we thank you for talking to us. And by the way, you're described as medical doctor, forensic psychiatrist, expert witness, and how come you have the title the terrorist therapist?
It's a registered trademark.
Because after 9/11, as I'm from New York originally and born and bred, and after 9/11, I asked myself, what could I do as a psychiatrist to help people the most? And clearly the most important thing that is happening in our lifetime is terrorism. And so I have been devoting myself to helping people, not just people who were in terrorist attacks, but people, all of us, who are living with the ongoing threat of terrorism.
Oh, well, we appreciate you coming on. Good stuff, and they should move in the direction you recommend. We do need more state mental hospital help for these homeless people. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, that's Dr. Carole Lieberman, and maybe she can help Deborah Mark with all her fears.